So we saw at the beginning of the semester that one of the earliest patristic authors who wrote on political theology, Irenaeus, who was writing in 180 CE, argued that true Christian faith makes a double movement. As a community, the Christian church both contrasts with all governments, according to Irenaeus, that surround it, but it also seeks ways to participate within them and transform them, making the order better from within. In other words, for the patristics, prior to Eusebius, Christian politics is both inside and outside of history, in the sense that it's always sort of pushing on the horizons and limits, but also working with it through and within the center of politics. The Christian church is never fully separated for Irenaeus, but is jumbled within this, what Augustine will later call the city of man. And in fact, Augustine gave what we've called participational theology, its sort of more classic and complex theological edifice in the city of God, arguing that Christianity is a pilgrim community founded by a perfect founder, Jesus, wandering through all times and epochs, discerning how the peace of the earthly city can be used and in what ways it needs to be resisted. That process of discernment, what can Christians resist in the earthly city and what can they cooperate with? So Christians were those people, according to Augustine and Irenaeus, who participated in government without ever having and the city of man, without ever having their identities totally swallowed up by their political community. There was always a remainder past any political movement, party, ideology, etc. And so Christians would contrast with their neighbors by both being more willing to participate and more willing to resist, depending on how the circumstances of politics were discerned. That's what we've been calling participational contrast theology, and its big other early on is, of course, Eusebian or the Constantinian turn. Clearly, Taylor is trying to work within this sort of tradition of participation, and that's how I'm going to try to present his famous 1999 essay, A Catholic Modernity, right? Because part of maybe what he's thinking about is in what way can Christians participate with, and in what ways do they have to contrast with the secular and liberal orders that predominate. So I'll start out with Christian participation in modernity, in liberal modernity, and why Taylor thinks that Christians can in fact cooperate, to put it in Augustine's terms, in aspects of the earthly peace that secular and liberal regimes set up. First, and I know this is building on how last time, we know that Taylor is famous for arguing that Christians helped create a secular age. Secularism is not the opposite of Christianity, but it's in a sense a byproduct of it, not entirely maybe intended or foreseen by the reformers and the counter-reformers. But one big factor in it that we've already discussed was personalism, right? That the reform and the counter-reform were very concerned with, do congregants, rank and file Christians really believe the doctrines and the creeds? Part of this had to do with a sort of rivalry between Catholicism and Protestantism, but part of it also had to do with the reformers' insistence that true belief has to pass through the individual conscience in some way at some point for it to be a mature faith. And so once the medieval world situation, in which people sort of communally participated without maybe knowing their beliefs fully or not really in this like embedded order that Taylor was talking about, right? Once that sort of passed from the scene, what you have is a setup in which all sides tacitly assume that they really want the people around them to believe, right? Be they Protestants, be they Catholics. And this is what Taylor calls personalism, and he thinks it's just a widespread feature of modernity. And in fact, it's so widespread that it's even taken up, he says in the essay for today, by secular humanists against the reformers. The reformers' own stance is taken up by secular people, the insistence on personal belief and whether this is actually something that people assent to, right? And it's true that this opens the door to unbelief, but Taylor says that this insistence on authenticity of personal belief, and he mentions what he calls the ethics of authenticity, which stem from Romanticism, the idea that all humans have a unique way of being human, they have a unique path or destiny in their life, and that they need to discern for themselves what truly resonates with their destiny, their fate, their circumstances. He says that that's actually a gain, that Christians should discern that as, if you like, something they can participate in, because it actually is a spin-off of something original to the Gospels, which is that the Gospels insist that true conversions come through love or change of the heart and not just through coercion, right? So, personalism. Second, Taylor talks about this thing, the affirmation of ordinary life. It's interesting. He says in your reading for today that there was a cultural revolution in the early modern period which dethroned the supposedly higher activities of contemplation and citizen life. Well, we've studied enough this semester to definitely know what's meant by the supposed higher activities of contemplation. That, again, was the Protestant criticism of the Roman Church, was that even if you think of a term like the universal priesthood of all believers, or Luther's insistence that sola fide saves you, there was a polemic against higher vocations in the Roman Church, right? The Roman Church didn't get rid of its higher vocations, think of monastics, nuns, etc., priests, but the Roman Church followed the reform in insisting on the importance that the laity has a way of being holy as well, right? That lay people, non-priests, non-religious, non-monks, non-monastics, that their holiness is not a lesser form of holiness per se, right? And Taylor thinks that this actually created a revolution in ethical and political culture, which he calls the affirmation of ordinary life. The other thing there that I'll just flick at is he says the life of the citizen. Well, that's clearly a reference to the classical tradition, Aristotle, Plato, where the highest thing you could be was a good citizen politically, and nothing else was higher, right, than that, and a kind of aristocratic citizen. So here's something interesting. Taylor's saying that we as modern people, and then he has a second thing to say about those of us who are Christians, we as modern people put a really big emphasis on ordinary life. And that ordinary life is good and is really the stuff of life, like family life, the household, little things, little pleasures, food, travel, right? Friendships. And then that's actually a cultural revolution against the ancient world that was highly aristocratic and hierarchical, but also has a reforming aspect on the medieval Catholic Church and its vocations. Again, he thinks that something strange has happened because secularists have taken the stance of the reformers against all Christians. Because in the name of ordinary life, you'll often hear non-Christians say to you, I don't really need, Sunday's fun day, I guess, is the stupid version of this, but you know what I'm saying. Like, I get fulfillment out of going on a hike, that's not a stupid thing, or seeing my friends or seeing my family, right? And I don't need the add-on of something extraordinary like praise and worship, let alone the Corpus Mysticum or whatever the Catholics are doing, right? So weirdly, the reformers and Protestants in general come under the same criticism from secular humanists that they levied against the church. Now, you might think, well, then why shouldn't Christians be against that? But again, Taylor sees in that something that Christians have to discern as being capable of participating within, which is the affirmation of the ordinary is recognizably derivative of Christian theology and the notion that God made the world and made the goods that are in it, and that those goods are in fact gifts that are given by God, right? For our conversion, for our holiness, for our ability to better love our neighbor, better love our family, better love our friends, right? So he sees the valuing of the ordinary actually as a gain, and that Christians should be, in that sense, affirming the modern shift toward the affirmation of the ordinary. A really big one for him here, which is sort of interesting to think about as students of politics, is what the reduction of suffering. He thinks that our civilization, it's humbling, but it's managed, a secular liberal civilization has managed more mobilization around compassionate reduction of suffering globally than Christendom ever did. And part of what he tries to argue in this essay, which would be worth discussing because I think it is debatable, but is that somehow the very breakout into secularism allows a solidarity that when society is limited by a Christian identity, becomes difficult to muster. So his examples of this, which might be slightly outdated now, not entirely, but are things like Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders. But this kind of mobilization that happens, right, around human suffering, that again, Taylor says, well, that has to do with the affirmation of ordinary life. It has to do with people saying suffering on another part of the globe, a famine, whatever, a crisis, refugees, that undermines something good that we all share as humans, which is our ordinary lives, our ordinary pleasures, and we should try to alleviate that kind of a suffering. We should have a desire to reduce that kind of a suffering. So once again, Taylor thinks, well, you could imagine this. I think I've heard Pope Francis say, it's kind of funny, he's like, the church is not an NGO. You could see it tumbling into just everything is about our charitable activity, et cetera. And Taylor has something critical to say about that in a moment. But he partly thinks, well, Christians passing through this particular epoch and age of liberalism and secularity can actually give an affirmation of the ordinary as valuable, because in fact stems from Christian theology, and because there is something authentically Christian or inspiring there, even when secular people carry it out, something like doctors going, across borders or whatever the example might be. Third, and this gets at the way Taylor is probably a very weird kind of liberal, isn't he? He's probably some kind of social democratic liberal, and he was a politician in Canada. But I say weird because he's not like Locke. He doesn't think you have rights by nature. It doesn't seem like that's not the argument he offers. Those of you who read like Kant, he's not like Kant. He doesn't think pure reason gives you rights. He seems to be arguing that out of our different cultural traditions, rights are the best language we have to formalize that what for some of us, those of us who are Christian, are basically theological beliefs or principles that we have, but that other people that are not Christian might find other modes of trying to justify. But rights are just, it's a way of protecting or formalizing the gains of personalism, which seems to imply a freedom of conscience, if you like, which gets formalized by liberal societies into things like freedom of speech, et cetera, and then an affirmation of the ordinary, right, as a life that, that the primary purpose of political life is to help ordinary people. There's a kind of humanism there that when we were reading Erasmus is very old and can take different configurations. It doesn't have to be liberal. I don't think it has to be liberal. But that humanism that we saw in Erasmus about the worry about ordinary folks and reducing suffering, that's part of why he thinks war is folly, is because he thinks ordinary people are going to suffer, right? So there's a kind of longer back history there that Taylor seems to think, well, the best political language we have for this now, even if it's problematic and has its limits, is rights. So in other words, again, to put this in the broader context of the course, Taylor thinks that Christians can participate in rights discourse, or even ought to participate in human rights discourse. Not because they think secular reason gives you rights, but because they see in secular rights an attempt to formalize politically something that they believe religiously, right? Okay, last point here, and this gets at something that was discussed in Alex's presentation, which is just, in some of his other writings, Taylor draws a distinction between open and closed secularism. The version of it you're getting here is his criticism of exclusive humanism, which I'll get to in a second. But basically, I think Taylor wants us to see that there are multiple kinds of ways that you can enact secularism. In some sense, he thinks secularism is a background set of conditions that we just live in, right? All that stuff we discussed last time about the immanent frame, et cetera. But in terms of politics, there are different ways to enact the secular. And so here I think what he's trying to say is Christians can discern and try to advocate for forms of secularity and rights that are open and not closed. By open, I think he means forms that don't try to aggressively liberalize the different traditions. Sometimes he talks about this in terms of deep diversity, but and I'm not sure, here he might part ways with Locke, because Locke in a way has a very high standard of how liberalized the traditions have to be. And so part of the backlash right now amongst religious conservatives to liberalism, because what's happened in my lifetime and what you guys have grown up with is that conservative Christians have become post-liberal, at least a significant portion of them are starting to play with maybe you suspend liberal rights, the press, freedom of conscience, if it's gone too, I don't know what, woke or too licentious or whatever the problem is. And it's anarchic or somehow destructive or persecuting Christians. That came up earlier, right? Now, so Taylor wants to sort of distinguish an open secularism that allows a kind of deep diversity of cultural traditions, right, where people can inhabit different communities, from a closed secularism that aggressively tries to change. At the furthest extreme, you can imagine a closed secularism like the Bolsheviks, which he mentions in the essay, or the Jacobins, who simply tried to eliminate Christianity or religious faith entirely from society. Obviously, Christians would have to be opposed to that kind of secularism. But this side of Bolshevism, you have other kinds of closed secularism. like French laïcité, right, where there are really strict rules about how much you can exhibit your religious beliefs or what religious beliefs are acceptable or not acceptable. So an open secularism is one that allows for traditional and conservative religious people to continue to practice their beliefs without having to necessarily revamp them in light of the dominant liberal ideology or whatever it is. If they had to revamp them, then Christians might not necessarily need to participate. That's really interesting because part of what's at stake here is just a prudential judgment right now in the United States. I think the way that the religious right has increasingly started to speak, and I know for a fact that Taylor would be critical of this, but doesn't mean you have to be, but just so you can see the debate. The way the Christian right speaks right now is as though the liberals in the United States are Bolsheviks or Jacobins who are basically 1 inch away from eliminating the Christian religion. I think Taylor's view is it's possible that it's basically an open secularism that Christians should participate within still, and that secular progressives are not about to shut down religion, right? And so the weird dynamic right now is who's going to shut down who first? Who's going to go post-liberal first in the United States? That's kind of the face-off we're in, is who's going to finally enact a sort of political culture that becomes the official political culture through either non-democratic means or means of exclusion that exclude significant swaths of Americans from representation or participation within political life, right? Okay, so that one's ambiguous, but all of these are a little bit ambiguous because I said last time that Taylor's a Hegelian, so he'll often say something and then he'll negate it and then he'll try to move past it. So there'll be like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? There'll be two things that look opposed and then he'll try to resolve them, right? And obviously secularism's like that, right? It looks like there's a secularism that abolishes religion, another one that remains open, and then he'll try to resolve the two into a possibility of like coexistence between exclusive humanists and religious conservatives, right? That might both in turn oppose the open form of secularism. Okay, but what about contrast? Because so Augustine says that in every city of man, the true church contrasts with the people around. It's never the same. And Taylor sounds a bit like Augustine, doesn't he? He says in this essay that the project of Christendom was probably always a mission impossible, that the attempt to create a social order that is perfectly Christian, it somehow reverses or betrays the Christian church in the very act of trying to coerce or create that civilizational mode. So why isn't liberal, because you could come up with a very weird Constantinian, Eusebian turn where liberalism itself is the official religion, if you see what I'm saying, which is another critique from the post-liberal right of liberals right now, is that liberalism is itself a religion. So then Christians who adopt liberalism are basically adopting a political religion on this view, right? So now if your entire identity becomes absorbed by a single ideology, that's not the Augustinian position. That's not the patristic position. If to be Christian is just to be liberal, then the Constantinian or Eusebian turn becomes liberalism itself. So where do Christians resist aspects of liberalism, according to Taylor? Well, one is around this exclusive humanism, right? And what he says about exclusive humanism I find very fascinating. As someone who came from a mixed family that includes exclusive humanists, right? And so growing up. And exclusive humanists, Taylor says, are an imminent revolt. They're a revolt from inside Western modernity. And the first thing he says about it is that it should spark in Christians, or maybe it does and we kind of flee from it, a kind of humility and unease. Because of what I was saying just a moment ago, which is that exclusive humanists seem to have accomplished feats, humanistic feats, that are in a sense Christian around solidarity or trying to alleviate suffering. And they seem to have done it better than we Christians have, or at least we Christians did, our ancestors did, when we had complete control over the society and it was a Christian society, right? And so part of that is a kind of unease, right? It's morally impressive. And okay, so here's something interesting Taylor says. He says the reason that people have gone in for exclusive humanism is predominantly because they find it morally or ethically attractive. That's fascinating, by the way. I know a lot of people on campus like apologetics and things like that. Taylor's view is that the reason that a lot of people stop being Christian or aren't attracted to Christianity is because they find exclusive humanism more ethically attractive. He doesn't really buy the science versus religion thing. He notes in the essay, he doesn't really think the problem is that science and religion don't mesh. He thinks they can mesh, they're perfectly fine. On the other hand, you'll often hear exclusive humanists say they don't mesh, that the reason they don't believe in religion is because of science. But Taylor actually thinks it's almost like a motivated reasoning. They're already ethically very allergic to Christianity, right? Like they have prior moral motives for being suspicious of Christianity, the Christian way of looking at things, Christian traditions, and so on. So this is the way he puts it in your reading. He says, it's already felt to be incompatible on a moral level, page 177. The obstacles to belief are primarily moral and spiritual rather than epistemic, right? Epistemic just being the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge. Isn't that interesting? That is not the typical view, but I actually find Taylor persuasive here, and we could debate it in discussion. But Taylor thinks the blockage that when you confront someone who's not Christian, he thinks the main blockages are actually moral or spiritual and not intellectual. And if you could somehow get at what the moral and spiritual blockages are, the intellectual stuff would follow. And I'm going to mangle the famous quote by Augustine again, but Augustine has that famous quote about people tell me that please tell me how to understand so that I might believe, to which I reply, believe so that you might understand, right? He reverses the role there. If you already have a blockage to believing at all, you won't be able to illuminate understanding or even see how they fit. So you'll stop short. Now, why are exclusive humanists why do they have these blockages? Why are they so skeptical of Christianity? Taylor's view of this is that, as he says, we live in a something analogous to a post-revolutionary climate. That's really interesting. Ever wonder why we call the medieval age the Dark Ages? It was not a dark age by a long shot. There were all kinds of beautiful architecture we can't even build now, Gothic cathedrals and so on. I'm not a nostalgic. I don't think we should go back to it, but wow, it's mind-blowing what some of our ancestors in Europe built, etc. But that language of the Dark Ages comes from a gain that exclusive humanists or secular liberal mobilization felt that it had over Christendom. So there's a kind of prickliness, Taylor says, about the prior regime. Part of what you're running into is, even though it's been several centuries, is that we're in the post-revolutionary situation, and so you have to tell a story that justifies the shift. And so part of what you do is you amp up a caricature of the past regime, and you say, it's a Dark Ages, there was no culture, there was no advancement of knowledge, even if that doesn't in fact hold true to history, the medieval age. Not only did the medieval age have incredible architecture and art, but there were advances in mathematics, or for those of us who are Christian, the lives of the saints. Some of the most inspiring Christian lives in history come from that period. St. Francis of Assisi, right? St. Catherine of Siena. I mean, their stories, if you read them, are kind of mind-blowing stories as Christians to read, how they lived, how they responded to the people around them. They still inspire people, right? So Dark Ages, why Dark Ages? Well, because of this spiritual moral blockage. The worry that exclusive humanists have is if the Christians get control again, they're going to roll back. They're going to roll back the gains we made morally and spiritually. Which gains? The ones we were talking about. Personalism, the very position that the exclusive humanists take against the Christians. Personalism, they take Christianity's own internal critique of itself, and then they throw it back at Christians. Personalism, affirmation of the ordinary. Christians get a hold of this. They're going to force us out of the affirmation we have, the humanistic affirmation we have of the alleviation of suffering, of personalism and freedom of conscience, of enjoying my ordinary life, enjoying my Sunday fun day. That term really grates on me. But it's like, it sounds so trivial to me. But on the other hand, there's something there. Some people are having fun on Sunday. And after all, God does say rest on the Sabbath. And so that's not entirely, it's obviously some kind of a remnant of Christian belief. Sabbath means rest. Sabbath means enjoy. Sabbath means stop. And I guess Sunday fun day is kind of a dumb version of that. But the worry is, from exclusive humanists, you let Christians get control, they're going to roll back all these gains. So Taylor's view is, it's not really about apologetics when you confront exclusive humanists. It's not about getting them to see science. Maybe in some cases, someone really needs help understanding that you can mesh Christian theology with the state of the art and science. But for a lot of people, that's not the problem at all. That's all way downstream of something much more fundamental, which is a moral or spiritual blockage to Christians governing or taking over society again, exclusively, right? Now, why does Taylor think, well, why shouldn't Christians just become exclusive humanists? And this is I found this a very fascinating argument when I read it in grad school. I was not yet a Christian, but it really resonated with me because I was probably somewhere either more on the exclusive humanist side, that's how I was raised by my father, or Nietzschean kind of anti-humanist, actually. This was probably me here, which I'll get to in a second. But I found this very challenging because most of my friends were exclusive humanists, being at Berkeley in grad school. And what he says about exclusive humanists, his problem with exclusive humanism is that it tends toward reversals. So he says exclusive humanism is given to, quote, disconcerting reversals, page 185. What's it missing? What is the secular humanistic left missing? It's missing deep ethical transformation, a radical decentering of the self in relation with God. So what happens in secular humanism is, on Taylor's telling, what happens in exclusive humanism is that there's not really a profound path to ethical transformation or the transformation of desire. Exclusive humanists tend to over-appraise rationalism and argument, and they think it's basically common sense that you should also be an exclusive humanist. And if you don't get that argumentatively, if you don't get that through reason, then you must either be stupid or wicked, right? In which case, over the long haul, exclusive humanists can become very impatient with the people that are actually in front of them, right? And Taylor cites Dostoevsky, who's also one of my heroes, and Dostoevsky has this idea that from abstract love of humanity in general, I can come to hate every human around me in particular. And I have to say that a lot of my exclusive humanists, either friends or co-travelers that I've known over the years, are very given to this reversal. In the name of loving humanity in general, I actually come to hate and be bitter, or the word for it is misanthropic. I'm philanthropic at the abstract level, but I'm misanthropic at the immediate level. Why? Because I don't have a mode for ethical transformation. I am missing, I've blocked myself off to the transcendent, Taylor says. The transcendent, a theocentric participation in the life of God, renews things like charity, forgiveness, mercy, starting again. If you don't have that, if basically your ethical code is largely abstract and has to do with persuading or convincing people of arguments, what do you do with people who just don't get the arguments? Eventually, you start really hating the people that are in the way of this tremendous moral progress you can make as human beings. You can't forgive them that they seem to be in the way. Also, what starts to disappear is I'm in the way. Okay, yeah, this is like Nietzsche says, once Christianity convinces you of the disease, it's the only cure. This is what I would have said when I was your age. Yes, I'm talking about sin. Once Christianity convinces you of the disease, it's the only cure. Yes, I'm talking about sin. Exclusive humanism loses a concept of sin, or that I might be the blockage to a better world. It's not just out there that's the problem, right? Page 172, 173, Taylor says, Christianity, theism offers a radical decentering of the self in relation with God, a theocentrism. Whereas a lofty humanism is too abstract, and faced with the immense disappointments of actual human performance, of actual human beings concretely falling short, grows into a sense of anger and futility. Here's Taylor again, page 185. From a flaming desire to help the oppressed to an incandescent hatred of all those who stand in the way. Wow, there's a lot of the 20th century in that one. From a flaming desire to help the oppressed to an incandescent hatred of all those who stand in the way. Dostoevsky's prophecy, starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism. So what's Taylor's point? It's that exclusive humanism is a defective humanism because it closes itself off to the transcendent, to God, and doesn't have a way for deep conversion that involves, one, seeing human limits in oneself and not just in one's opponents, but also a renewal of spirit before God. And so his view is that although exclusive humanists are cousins or even grandchildren of Christian theology, they can spin off into kind of dryness, bitterness, anger, misanthropy. Philanthropy can become misanthropy. Philanthropy in general can become misanthropy in particular. And again, if I can be a little bit caricature here, I have to say that some of the leftists I have known and loved in my life can get so misanthropic and so depressed and down because the world doesn't get better on their own, by their own standards. And then it starts to seem like, well, the only thing in the way is the Republican Party or the conservatives or something like that, or religious people at large, or, right? And I think, so part of what Taylor's trying to do here is he's trying to sort of arguably subvert exclusive humanism from within and say to exclusive humanists, your humanism would be more reviving and better if it reopened itself to the transcendent. By the way, one other thing he says there is that exclusive humanists can sometimes, even though they mobilize in these really amazing ways, it can sometimes be sentimental, right? Because it's like cause of the month for someone over there. I'm reminded of Dorothy Day, who we read, who said you need to know two things about the poor when people would show up. You need to know two things about the poor. They smell and they're ungrateful. Why did she say that? Her point is your heart going to change before the human being? If you expect a big thank you, then you're here for the wrong reason. You're here for sentimental reasons. Be prepared to have all your sentiments lost in this process. You see what I'm saying? I think Taylor's trying to say something similar, that Christianity and the world religions have resources for the rejuvenation of the human heart that exclusive humanism lacks. And if I can say one last thing about that, he says exclusive humanists start to struggle with any meaning before death or suffering at all, such that almost suffering has to be abolished entirely. Okay, so what you end up with, and this is what I'll end on, is Taylor says, well, we basically have a four-cornered debate in Western societies. Simplifying. The four-cornered debate is between exclusive humanists, which I just covered quite a bit. They seem to make a new solidarity possible, and their humanism seems in some ways to humble Christians because they seem to be able to go beyond Christian sort of limits. At the same time, they're given to violent, abstract, misanthropic reversals. One of the political theologies we've read arguably goes this direction, liberation theology, if and when it throws in with people like Castro, which Dussel does say, right? Like exclusive humanist, militarized revolutionaries, arguably. My point here is Christian theology can take on the attributes of exclusive humanism, potentially. Feel free to argue with me on that one. But just to get you to think, one of the political theologies we've read arguably takes on some of the features of that, right? Second, so one corner of the debate is exclusive humanists. Second corner is an anti-humanism that has emerged. This is the whole stuff on Nietzsche in the essay, which is really fascinating. Taylor says that basically that exclusive humanism splintered, or there was a schism, and the name or face you could put on that schism is Nietzsche, but there are a bunch of different people under that umbrella, Foucault, Derrida, postmodernism, and both on the right and the left, by the way. But what this militates against is exclusive humanism's notion that there's nothing higher. So one way to understand Nietzsche is as the return of a heroics, or a sense that there needs to be something higher. And for those of you who've read Nietzsche, he thinks Christians should be socialists. He's like, of course Christians should be socialists. Why? Because both of them are interested in alleviating all human suffering. And he despises both of them, right? He wants to get rid of liberalism, socialism, Christianity, because he thinks they're all of a piece. Pity, compassion, unegoism.
So he thinks there needs to be something higher, is that like the Ubermensch he was referring to?
Yeah, something higher, but what's the return of the higher is the big question here. So it could be a warrior ethics, it could be a new class hierarchy, it could be a new great men, probably should just leave it at great men, or great men and women.
But it just can't be God for Nietzsche.
It can't be God for Nietzsche, right. So what it shares with exclusive humanists is that it's close to God. But what it doesn't share with them is an egalitarian love your neighbor code that is obviously a secularization of the Gospels, right? It does not share that with it. So it's atheistic, right? So he says exclusive humanists and anti-humanists can team up against Christians to sort of say God is dead. However, exclusive humanists and Christian humanists can team up against Nietzscheans to try to advance compassion, empathy, the reduction of suffering, the affirmation of the ordinary, personalism. Taylor says that one spin-off of the reassertion of hierarchy is things like fascism, right? A Nietzscheanized politics that says cruelty is good, hierarchy is good, those are back, right? And some of the political theologies we've read have re-Nietzscheanized, arguably. So if you look at someone like Carl Schmitt or some of the nationalists or some of the reactionaries, they've taken on from anti-humanist hierarchy the reassertion of like cruelty, warrior code ethics, against compassion, against mercy, against humanism. In some ways, the polemic against the exclusive humanists has become so strong that they've thrown out Christian humanism entirely and have themselves become sort of Nietzscheanized Christians, right? Third corner is Christian humanism. Obviously, that's where Taylor places himself, right? It's a form of, it shares with the exclusive humanists a desire for human flourishing, an affirmation of the ordinary, human rights, but supposedly it's the superior position for Taylor because it can rejuvenate itself through theocentrism, through a relationship with God, a relationship with the transcendent that revives us, that teaches us certain limits that we have, that teaches us that we're also part of the problem. And the fourth or final corner is a Christian reaction or anti-modernism. Taylor says it views secular humanism as just a mistake and wants a return to the earlier view of things, page 180. As I said, weirdly can have aspects of pre-Christian warrior ethics. So then Christ is reconfigured into sort of like a masculine or strong or warrior figure, and there's kind of a cult of strength that really comes out of classical paganism that was itself opposed to Christianity when it first appeared on the scene, for being a slave morality or morality of compassion and not sufficiently warrior enough, right? So arguably, so Taylor, in the language of this class, and I'll end on this, for Taylor there are two temptations for Christians in terms of political theology. And by the way, he says the different groups can gang up on each other because they share one part but not another part with each other, right? So obviously Christian humanists and Christian anti-modernists share Christianity, right? On the other hand, Christian humanists tend to ally sometimes with exclusive humanists to a point, whereas Christian reaction anti-modernists tend to ally with anti-humanism and hierarchy to a point, right? So you can scramble up the corners of the debate and line up the teams in different ways depending on what the groups are emphasizing, essentially. And I'll end on this. So there are two political theological temptations, according to Taylor. Two temptations, if you like, in the desert for Christians. One is a temptation toward an abstract, humanistic, misanthropic left, a left that is exclusively humanistic, but basically thinks it can make the world better without God and religion, and you can get rid of it, or religion and God largely becomes sort of superfluous to a humanistic project, to my efforts, to what I can do, to humanity saving itself, right? That's one temptation, where essentially your Christianity becomes more and more kind of incidental or privatized or doesn't have anything to say to exclusive humanism, right? Just exclusive humanism becomes your prevailing code. But the other one is a temptation towards a Nietzscheanized return of cruelty and hierarchy that is itself not really Christian, but it's an attempt by the modern world to punch through the immanent. It's an attempt, in a way a religion. Taylor sees Nietzsche as having a religious impulse. The religious impulse is it's suffocating. This is a suffocating program that exclusive humanism has, where we just try to reduce suffering. Those of you reading Nietzsche with me in the next class, he calls this the last man. We talk about this quite a lot. The last man is someone who just, all they care about is mere life, and they just blink. They have no great acts left in them. They have no great spirituality. Taylor's view is, in a weird way, Nietzsche still misses God, if you like, and wants something higher. And exclusive humanism is suffocating, right? But that's a second temptation, is that Christians will Nietzscheanize, right, and take on the anti-humanism of a kind of Nietzscheanized right as a political theology. And in both of those, in language, of course, get completely absorbed into that political program, such that, in Augustinian terms, the church has no leftover, it has no contrast. All it is it's so participatory, if you like, that there's no remainder.